Welcome to the Moms in Ministry podcast. We are so glad you're joining us for another episode. My name is Jolea, and I'm the founder of the Moms in Ministry Collective. And I'm joined today by our co-host, Estella. Estella, hello. How are you?
Hi, good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Doing great. It's another sunny, cold day here. We're recording in January, and so the weather in Texas is finally cooled off.
Yeah. And I hate it.
Yeah,
I hate the cold weather.
I have a love-hate. I'm a January baby. My birthday's in January, like all the good things, but I still hate the cold. Except, the hotter it gets over the summers, the more I'm like, I can't wait for it to get cold. So I'm really trying to be appreciative of these few weeks of chilly weather that we're getting right now. So I'm excited to dive into another episode. If you don't know, we're in a series called Your Best Self. Maybe somebody sent this to you, but here at Moms in Ministry, our goal is to resource women who both serve in ministry in some capacity, whether volunteer, maybe you're an employee on staff at a church, maybe you are a pastor, a lead pastor, an associate pastor, whatever the capacity is, maybe you're a nonprofit founder, but then you're also a mom and have a family that you're raising. And a few years ago, I just had this really frustrating epiphany of like, God, I want to be able to do both well. Like, why can't we do both well? We hear a lot of stories about kids who grew up in pastors' homes that struggle now. And I was like, God, I want to figure it out. How do we figure this out? And I think that one of the biggest answers is community, knowing that you're not the only person doing this, that you're not alone, and that there are other people just like you that are trying to live out the calling that God has given them outside of their home, but also fulfilling the calling that God has given them inside of their home, which is our first ministry. So excited to get into this episode of Your Best Self. Today, we're focusing on marriages. And this is going to be a really good conversation. Estella and I were talking before we hit record. It's something we don't talk about often enough. And the reality is a lot of marriages are under attack. And we just want to be bold and address things directly. This conversation will be pretty candid. We're going to be honest and try to share what we feel like God is placing on our heart. But I think mostly it's a burden for marriages, a burden for people that might be struggling in their marriages. And we've talked about kids. We could talk about our kids all day long. But when it comes to our marriages, I think that it's important that we also talk about this as well. I thought, I want to talk about prioritization. So we both started at the end of last year, just kind of writing down lists. And we were talking about this again before we hit record about how we were writing down our priorities for 2025 and how God had to restructure them. But before we talk about priority, I just thought, just to share a little bit of our stories and where we are so you can connect, maybe what might fit you. I'm actually in a blended family. So I was married once before when I was really young. I was 19 going on 20. I was having my first son and I married my son's dad, really because I just wanted to be the good Christian girl that I was raised to be and thought that getting married would fix it. There was a lot that happened. And, I'm so grateful for a healing journey. I actually have a great relationship with my son's dad, and it didn't work out. We were very young, made several mistakes, and it wasn't a good relationship. It wasn't a healthy relationship. And there were a few things that happened that it was necessary for us to not be together. And so I got divorced when I was 22, and I met my husband a few years later, and we are going on 5 years married. And so we both brought kids into the relationship and then had one more. And so, we deal with a lot of different dynamics and have to fight through a lot of different things that are different from the nuclear family that the mom and dad are the parents to all the kids in the house. And, it's just the one single family unit without outside influences. We have a really special set of challenges that we navigate on a regular basis. Some have gotten better, some get harder as you go. But I definitely am excited this year. We're actually going to dive more into blended families throughout the year and just continue to provide resources, because I know that it's more and more common. And I just want people to know that they're not alone. I would love to say that all my kids, everything's the same and, have the same parents, but this is the reality of where we are. And I do see still God's hand, and he's been so full of grace as we've navigated it and tried to figure things out, and have been married now for 5 years. Stella, what about you?
My husband and I met when I was 15, turning 16. So I've been with him for about 20 years, but we've been married 17. Mm-hmm. It would be 18 in May.
Yeah.
We have 2 boys, Caleb, who is 17, and he'll be 18 in July, and then Logan, who is 10.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's been a minute.
18 whole years, almost 18 years.
Yes.
And I often say I'm very grateful for Estella, because I always am like, I'm not the expert in marriage. And I hope that you guys hear that as we start this episode. And that's why this is just kind of a depiction of moms in ministry and the purpose it serves, because we're not here to tell you what to do. We're not here to tell you how to be married and what that looks like, but we are here to have a conversation about it that might bless you, that might give you what you need in this season for your marriage. And one of the things that we wanted to address first is priority. This is called Moms in Ministry, right? So it's not married moms in ministry. And yet I think that is a really common, I don't want to call it a mistake, but it's a really common issue for women. Once you become a mom, it's like that is your whole world. Your kids are your whole world. When we were doing our priority list, what we found is like you would put God first, right? And then you kind of list out kids, then your husband, then your work, then your ministry. For me, it was all over the place. My priority list was a mess. But I think that what God revealed to both of us was just where our marriages go on the priority list.
With me, I was mapping out my priorities for 2025. I had my family first, my husband second, and God third, because I am like, God, we're good. You know, your relationship with between me and you is probably better than my relationship with my family and my husband. So I put God number 3. And as far as him reprioritizing, he kind of corrected me, and he was like, no, I need to be number 1. Mm-hmm. Your husband needs to be number 2. Ooh. And your children need to be number 3, because if you and your husband are not good and you don't have a marriage and you don't have a family,
yes,
because family was my number 1 priority, because I wanted to work on being just together and present and being a family. So God showed me that if I'm not in your marriage, then there is no marriage.
Yeah.
Secondly, you need to honor, respect, and love your husband so that you can have a marriage, so that you can be a good mom, so that you can stay together in order to complete this family that you want. And I think that that's a common struggle. Like you said, it's easy to prioritize your kids or even other things before your husband and your marriage, because that's life. And when you're with someone for an extended amount of time, it's so easy for them to be on that back burner.
Yeah.
But in God's eyes, he wants your marriage to be directly under him, knowing that that's where everything else stems from.
Right. I think that's so true. And that's why we want to have this conversation, because marriages are under attack. There are people that are struggling a lot right now. And the truth is that some of it comes from the way the world celebrates it. So I'm saying that the enemy is really intentional about how he does these things. So for us, like the world celebrates a mom who's a good mom, who like does everything for their kids and is up with them, you know, late at night and early in the morning, and makes time for nothing but them. They are number one. That's what's celebrated these days, right? That is what's prioritized. Like that's, but I think the enemy might do that because he knows if we could just get our kids to be the top priority and our marriages second, then it's easier for him to come in and dismantle the marriage, which ultimately hurts the kids, even when we don't see it. And so I think it is important for us to recognize when it comes to priority lists, and God did the same thing with me, your husband or your spouse is your number 1 priority. And then it is your kids, because like you said, if there is no marriage, then there is no family, and it inadvertently or directly will impact your children if your marriage dissolves or if your marriage falls apart. And so priority matters, placement matters, and that might require that you evaluate your life in this season and ask yourself, are there places where I have you know, especially when you've been married for so long, where I've kind of put my spouse on the burner or made them, you know, play second role because of the kids, or I've used the kids as an excuse to not be intentional about my marriage, to not spend more time, to not, you know, be present with my spouse when needed.
There's a book that I got from a Christian bookstore, and it's called Seasons, and it talks about how there are 4 seasons in a year, and just like there's seasons throughout life, there's seasons in your marriage,
right,
where you feel like, you know, the honeymoon stage, you're in love and they could do no wrong in your eyes, and all of these things when you first meet someone, and then reality hits. And then you have the winter, and it talks about the winter in marriage, and so there's times where you probably feel cold towards one another, and then you have the summer and all of these things. And I would say with 17 years, I definitely have been through those seasons probably multiple times.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I know what God says about marriage. And that's one of the things that I wanted for us to discuss today, because a lot of times if we don't truly read the word of God for subject matter, then it's kind of, you know, we get a bunch of Jesus's lives, the miracles he did, and all of these other things. But what does he say about marriage and the importance of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it would be good just to walk through some of those things. I think it's important for us to walk through what the Bible says about marriage and be reminded of that.
Yeah. So when it comes to scripture, we know that first, marriage goes all the way back to the beginning upon creation with Adam and Eve. We know that marriage is ordained by God. We know that God said, when you and your spouse come together, you leave your mother and your father and you become one. And so we have to realize first that marriage is a part of God's plan.
Right.
And it's a foundation for the family.
So good.
Because out of marriage comes children, out of marriage comes everything else. But in Matthew 19, there's a story about the Pharisees, and it talks about how the Pharisees, you know, they were always trying to trip Jesus up with these questions and put him in situations to see what he would say. But they asked Jesus, testing him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? And Jesus responds in Matthew 19:4-6. He says, haven't you read the scriptures? So once Jesus says that, the Pharisees then come back with a question, and they're like, well, then why did Moses say it was okay to divorce your wife? Because Moses gave them that law in the Old Testament. And so Jesus replies, and he's like, he gave you that law only because your hearts were hardened. But in the beginning, this is not God's will.
Right.
And he goes on to say, you know, if you do divorce, he lists his qualifications, has to be for infidelity or things like that. And then it is okay to divorce. But other than that, you have to try and really work out this marriage. And I kind of laughed at their response, because Jesus, the disciples, or whoever it was that was listening, said, well, then it's almost better if a man doesn't marry, because, which I forgot that was in there when I went back and read it, because Jesus was like, hey, if you're going to be married, then this is it. Yeah. This is it. Like, you cannot, you know, divorce for any reason. And I think it's because back in the day, you know, if they were so by law, that they were thinking, well, Moses gave us the okay. Right. And then Jesus comes back around and said he only gave it because you're hardened hearts. Right. But truly, this is not God's will. And so when we put that into perspective of, one, you're having to be with this person who not only meets you at your best, because we all put forth our best when we first meet someone, and we're kind and we're patient and we're funny and we're all of these things. But then when you live with someone, you get to kind of see them at their worst.
Right. 100%.
You see them at their best, and you see them at their worst, and you see them on their bad days. And so you have to learn to love someone through all of that. And Paul also speaks about how it is almost better to remain single, because Paul had, but he said to each is given this, only if you can do it. Yeah. But he said it'd be better for you to marry than to burn, meaning burn with lust and passion, because it's a natural desire. So Paul, he said if he had his way, I'd have everyone be single and just focus on God. But, you know, most of us are married, are in relationship. We desire relationship, and that's because God created us that way. Right. But ultimately, Paul did say, if an unbeliever depart, then let him depart. Right. Meaning, if you are living with someone and you are trying to do right and go to church and live for God, but this individual is just an unbeliever and they do not want anything to do with anything and they decide to leave, then according to God, you are not held accountable for their actions or for them leaving, and it is okay for you. So there are certain circumstances where the Bible and Jesus gave the okay to divorce, but not for a lot of the reasons why we do it in America.
That's where I was going to make a point. I think, again, in this day and age, it's glorified, but I just see it. I see the intentionality of the enemy's plan and how now it's normal. It's normal to divorce. It's normal to see your favorite celebrities divorce and get married and divorce and get married and divorce. And it is kind of like it's just an option. Like, I think that for so long it wasn't an option until it was, and society has taken that and run. And so to not divorce when things get hard, it's kind of weird. It's countercultural as believers to not do that, right? And so Jesus gives us, the examples of when it is okay. And then outside of that, we really have to look inward and figure out, okay, well, if God has called me to this marriage that God has brought together, let no one separate, we are one. How do we fight for what we have? And fighting is hard. Fighting for your marriage is hard. Fighting with your spouse is hard, but even fighting for your marriage to stay together is hard. It's difficult. It takes work and it takes time, and it takes you being mature when you don't want to be mature and kind when you want to be petty. And so I think that we have to continue to figure out how to fight fair. And even one of the things I've learned in fighting fair is that you don't say the word divorce. As soon as you say it, or when you plant that, it now opens the door to an option that wasn't there before. If you and your spouse have decided we're not going to say the word divorce, even when we are just spitfire angry at each other. It's like we're angry at each other, but there is no other option but to work it out. Divorce gives you the option to step away, to say, okay, well, if we're going to keep arguing like this, like there's another option for us, versus no, if we're going to keep arguing like this, we need to figure out how to get into a better space.
And I think that's just so important to realize, one, that marriage is hard. Jesus said it was hard because he said, if you're going to get married, God is going to give you the grace to do it. But then it's the scripture that he said was almost like, it's going to take some work. You have to be willing to put the work in. So you have to realize that it is going to take work. But two, if you're unhappy, ask yourself why. And I've had to do this in my own marriage, because there have been times where after 17 years, even before 17 years, where I've wanted to walk away because we fight too much. We can't see eye to eye on anything. I'm not happy. You're not happy. Why are we together? All of those things that I feel like most marriages at some point, probably you have those thoughts. I don't think when you're with someone for 20, 50, 60 years, you're going to have some bad times. You speak to anyone who's been married a long time, they'll let you know it wasn't easy. It took work. It took compromise, because you're living with someone who doesn't think like you, who's just different. Yeah. And you can have your areas where you agree, but they're not going to agree with you on every single area. They're going to have their own opinions. But just asking yourself, why are you unhappy? Are you happy? Are you unhappy because it's something within yourself? Is your spouse doing something that makes you unhappy, or is it both of you? And determining what it is that you need to do. Are you both willing to work on the marriage? And that is the biggest thing, because if you're both willing to put the work in, then there's hope. Right. If there's only one of you that is willing to put the work in and the other doesn't, then that makes it a little more complicated.
In both marriage situations, because that was kind of the situation I found myself in at 22, I knew the scripture. I knew that God said what God brings together, let no man separate. And I was willing to fight for my marriage. I was going to do everything I could to stay in my marriage. And yet on the other end, there was nothing left. And so there was no choice but to walk away, and so that's where I found myself there. But then I thought about being in a marriage now where we have two believers in the home, two people who, even walking into the marriage, we agreed, like, we're going to fight for this marriage. We're going to do the right things. And I'm grateful because we both had and I think there was like this unacknowledged commitment that we were not going to be the same people, even ourselves. Like we're not the same people we were in the past. And so we fight differently. We communicate differently. What I have learned is that you can only control yourself. And I think sometimes we'll go to God and we're like, God, if you would make them do this, this, and this, if they would apologize for this, and if they stop leaving the toothpaste open, if they would, just do all of these things correctly, then I would act right. And I think one of the things I've had to do often is eat my pride. And just control what I do. I need to control my own responses, even when my spouse doesn't respond the way I would like them to. I need to control my reactions. Do I run to God? Do I go and gossip? And I want people to know this too. You can only control yourself. And God is the only person that can change your spouse. Like your spouse has to want to change and be different. Like you cannot force somebody to change and be different unless they desire it. And so if you're wanting your spouse to change, your best bet is taking it to God. And so covering your spouse in prayer daily, like praying and petitioning. A few weeks ago, we talked about praying and fasting, like fast, like if this is really a burden on your heart, I do think that a part of that is how often do we pray for our spouses? And I know that sometimes they're kind of just like this, like they just are there, right?
Yeah.
They just exist and you don't think about it. But how often are we praying for our spouses and petitioning for them that God would move in their lives, that God would bring transformation? And I think sometimes we think it's them and it's really us. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but I'm like, why? And God is like, literally, it's you.
Yeah.
It is you,
Yeah, he's for sure corrected me on a few things and even corrected my husband on a few things to where he's been open about it and was like, I know I need to do this.
Right.
And with marriage, it is work, but the work is so worth it, especially if you have children, because your marriage is obviously not only affecting you, but it's affecting them also. Like you said, when a mom or a dad leaves, that affects the kids.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody.
And family is just so important to God. And the reason why I wanted to speak on marriage is because a lot of us are in ministry. A lot of us serve in the church. And even if you don't, you know that it could affect every single area of your life. Even if you're not serving in ministry at this moment and you work a job, it's going to affect how you are at work.
Right.
And more so if you're in ministry and you're in a position where you're ministering to others and you know that your marriage isn't where it needs to be, or you're really having some trouble in your marriage, that can affect your ministry.
Right.
It could affect really God working through you. And I believe there's even a scripture that says to be right with your husband or your wife so that your prayers won't be hindered. It could affect God answering your prayers because he's like, hey, I need you to work on this.
Right.
And how much more so is our marriage important when Jesus said, if you're not even right with a brother, don't offer me your sacrifice.
Right.
Go make it
100%.
right. How much more so in our marriage do we need to be right when we're trying to minister to others and we're trying to do all of these things, giving it to God, and God is like, you're not even functioning at your full potential because you need to work on what you have going on at home.
Yeah. I think about this quote that's like, marriage is not 50-50, it's 100%, 100%. We both have to be 100%. And if things are not working, if you're struggling, when you're 100% in something, it's like whatever it takes to fix it. And so I just want to encourage people to just find resources. I know not everybody maybe can afford counseling or marriage counseling. I know that, so there's so many different situations, but who can you talk to? Can you talk to a pastor? Don't do this by yourself. Find community and be open in that community. 'Cause I think you'll find, one, you're not alone. So many people walk through these things. And I think that the enemy would love for us to just be isolated and think that we're the only people struggling in our marriage, only people having a hard time, only people having the same fight over and over again. But when you find community, you also find resource. I think that we can be encouraged by hearing the stories of other people who fought through things and came out on the other side, that they can share that with us and show us that it's possible. So I think it's important to even get outside perspective, to have friends that will be like, no, you were really wrong when you said that. You should not have, left that night or, slammed the door, whatever it is, to have people just kind of give you some outside perspective, even to have people listen. I think that sometimes even for me personally, when you get really high up in ministry, there are not very many people that you can share your life with personally, because you feel judged. You tell the person you're ministering to, oh my God, yeah, I got in a terrible
fight with her anymore.
Yeah, they're like, oh, well, she's not qualified to tell me anything because she doesn't even know how to be married. So what I had to do was I had to really get intentional about finding people I could go to. So for a while, I would just be isolated, and then I'm in my head, and we'd get into the same fight over and over again about the smallest things. And then in my head, I am running through it, and I'm frustrated, I'm angry, and I'm saying all the things in my head that I didn't say out loud, and it's making it worse, and I'm doing the silent treatment. But when I had a friend that I could go to where I could just be like, I am just frustrated, I am just upset, and they would talk me through and be like, yes, I've experienced that, and this is what I did, and validated my feelings, because a lot of it is valid, but then also gave me fresh perspective. It helped so much. It helped. I think that community and having people just to talk, and people that support marriage too. Let me just say this: people who believe in marriage, people who value marriage, don't take your marital problems to people who are like, listen, just leave him. Every single thing. Oh, he closed the door wrong. I think it's a value system. I think marriage has to be a value for you. Like, you have to value marriage. And I think hopefully in this episode, you have just been reminded about where it falls priority wise. Like, your marriage is that important. And so if it holds that much value to you, then you have to surround yourself with other people who also value marriage at the same level, because there are people who are like, well, I don't really need to be married. I have this spouse, but they could come or go and it wouldn't really be a big deal to me. But biblically, it is a big deal. It's a big deal to God. And so it should be a big deal to us as well.
Yeah. And I think too, just us talking about, okay, so one, we've said marriage is hard. Two, we know now the importance, but what are some ways that we can improve our marriage and get it to a better place?
Yeah. I had a few thoughts, and I love your thoughts as well. I just learned a lot just trying to slow down. I am a high functioning, high capacity woman. It takes a lot to keep up with me. It just does. And when I got into this marriage with my husband, there was a lot of self-awareness that came into it, because I was just bulldozing, like your girl, just
crushing goals.
I know, getting things done around the house, just bulldozing through life, because that's what I've always done. Like, I don't need anybody. He did a video. I built something. He's like, my wife's a strong, independent woman who does not need my help. And I'm like, that's like the definition of our marriage. But what I had to realize is, where does that come from? Because here's the truth. God has called us as women to submit to our husbands. And I know that's really hard for women to hear. And it was really hard for me to hear, because I grew up in households where, after my parents divorced, like, it was my mom, and then I have a really strong grandmother. So I got matriarchs, and then I had a really strong great grandmother. So I have matriarchs of the family who made all of the decisions. Some, one was a widow, one had been divorced, but ended up having to raise families on their own without a spouse, without a husband, and make all the decisions. And so going into this marriage, there was a lot of self-awareness of, oh, I'm like this because that is all I know. I only know strong women who don't wait on a man to tell them, how to do things and when to do things and to make decisions. But I had to learn to pull back a little bit and actually allow my husband to lead. And I would be like, lead me. And there's a quote, I don't know, but it's like, lead me when I want to be led, and that's the vibe I was giving at all times. But I think that to prioritize, you have to first get into the right position, which means when it comes to decision making, like, are you involving your husband in the decisions that are being made? Now, I'm not saying like down to, whether or not you go to Chick-fil-A, but like, are you involving him in big financial decisions? Are you involving him in, ministry pivots that you're making? Are you involving him in job opportunities, and like literally inviting him into those places of your life? I think that's just important. And it was a learning process for me to involve him, and then pause and actually let him make decisions, because I'm like, I'll make decisions in a second. But for him, like, I literally have like been like, hey, I need help figuring out like if we should do X, Y, and Z. He's like, let me think about it. And I'm like, for how
You're like, can I get an answer now?
Yeah, for like how long, you know, like
I'll
is
give
it
you 5 minutes.
I know, is it like and his like, let me think about it, it's like 2 or 3 days and your girl is like dying. And so I had to just be okay with it being slower and different, and but I feel so much more secure when my husband is leading, because that's what it's supposed to be, right? Otherwise, I've gotten into these places where I feel frazzled and overwhelmed, and because I get out of his covering and I'm trying to do it all myself and figure everything out all by myself, and I can do it, but it's not in alignment even with what God wants me to do.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big one. I have really been intentional about scheduling time. So we have a date night weekly, or at least bi-weekly, that we do. I schedule get stuff done time where we will just sit for a couple of hours, because we are like 2 ships passing in a night. Sometimes we just have so much going on, where we'll sit down and like, hey, date night is date night, where we don't talk like business, shop, home, kids, you know, all the things. But like the get stuff done is, okay, we need to make a few decisions, you know, let's sit down, let's buy this thing that we need to purchase to replace, you know, something. We made a lot of decisions in our get stuff done time, but it was great because it was, and what it kept me from doing was nagging a lot, because I knew, hey, come Saturday, we have this time set aside, and I could like put my list together. I need him to do this, and I'm going to bring up the fact that he said he was going to do this, but he didn't. And so we're just going to table it for then. So that's something that I've done.
Yeah, I have implemented though this year date nights, which is something we've never done, but I have realized that I had really put my husband on the back burner just because of busyness. But I think that even once kids become involved, it is so easy to do that. So prioritizing that time and making your husband a priority. And if you know his love language, then trying your best to meet that, because your husband may not know what it is, and he may not know what is going wrong or why you feel the way you feel. And I remember listening to something one time, and it just stuck with me always, is how as women, we expect our husband to just know how we feel, what we want, without communicating. And then we get upset that he doesn't know what we want when we didn't communicate it, because we just think he should know.
Yeah.
You know,
so true.
I have been that way so many times. And I'm like, but you should just know this.
Yeah.
And then it's like, but how realistically, how do we expect them to know if we don't communicate with them?
100%.
And communicating with them when we're not angry, calm, and we're not doing anything and everything is good, and just saying, hey, you know what? I just kind of want to just bring this up because, you know, let you know that this, when you do this, it really makes me feel this way.
Right.
And I really want our relationship to work, and I really want us to have a happy marriage. So I just wanted to let you know that that's, you know, so finding ways of communicating and the right time to communicate, and also making each other a priority. And sometimes that means that you'll have to just not do things with the kids. It's okay to leave the kids with grandma or someone, but finding a babysitter and making sure that you do date nights without the kids.
Yeah, I think so funny. I hope that somebody takes that, the love language. You can take the test online. It's free, but it's like lovelanguages.com, 5lovelanguages.com. I think, don't, you know, but Google it, 5 love languages, and you can take the test. It's important for you to know, you know. But another thought I had though was just realizing that a lot of our husbands never got a good example of what it looks like to be a husband. And that was one of the things I had to even just recognize with my own spouse and me, like just seeing a healthy marriage that didn't end in divorce. Like we both walked in with not great examples of what a marriage should look like. And so I think giving your husband grace when they don't know, you know, what to do, and over communicating and even helping them by saying like, this is what I'm feeling. This is what I would have wanted to experience in that moment, versus being frustrated when they don't meet your expectations. I think so many miscommunications happen just because of missed expectations. And Gilbert and I have gotten really good at that, of being like, this is what I'm expecting. Like we'll over communicate before something, because we have gotten in so many arguments when he was like, I thought you wanted me to do X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, no, like that's not what I wanted. And I'm angry because why couldn't you just figure it out? But we have really started to try to set our expectation and be really clear with it. And he's even come to me and been like, hey, you know, we're about to do this. what is your expectation for the day? There was a time where he got a day off and I was off, and it's like the perfect storm. Like, we're off together. It's amazing. And I literally turned to him, because sometimes I'm more of a homebody. Like, when I'm off, like, I want to chill at home, maybe run some errands, but like, I recognize that my love language is quality time. And so sometimes we'd both be off and he's like, I have to go do this, this, and this. Like, he has a list in his own head of things he was already planning to do and trying to get stuff checked off of, like, maybe his to-do list. And I would get so mad. I'm like, he's just gone. Like, he just keeps leaving. This year I was like, oh, my love language is quality time. And so the next time we had a day off together, I was like, hey, I just want to be really clear tomorrow.
You're not running any errands.
Right. So long as we do it together. So I was like, if you want to run an errand, like, I want to come with you. Like, let's do it together. And I was like, that, it was so much better. We had a great day and we did a lot of stuff. We got a lot of stuff done. But it was because I knew myself a little bit better and could communicate with him. Like, this is what it was. Like, I am just desiring to, like, spend real quality time with you. Kids too, like, if you do have a date night, ours a lot of times are not out. Like, we actually do date nights at home. Like, we'll get sushi from our local sushi restaurant, and we'll sit and watch a show and eat sushi, and it's amazing. But I know that some parents, like, if their kids call or beckon or something like that, like, our kids know it's date night, which means most of the time they're in bed because it's Thursday night, so it's not the weekend and everybody's just up. But like, you're in bed, we're having date night, and we will tell our kids that. And I think that some parents see that as, like, what do you call it? Like, rejecting their kids. But really what you're doing is you're giving them a good example of what a marriage should look like. You're showing your kids mom and dad love each other, and they're prioritizing their time together, and they're spending time together, and it's not going to involve you, you know? And I think that's okay to do.
And it's so important. And overall, just everything that we're talking about, I feel like hopefully will help someone in their marriage, and realizing you're not alone when you have struggles, that everybody has them. Everyone who's been married has had them or will have them at some point. And you have to learn to be patient and love each other and forgive one another. And it requires a lot of forgiveness, a lot of patience. But overall, at the end of the day, when you ask yourself, what am I fighting for? Then it makes it worth it. It makes it worth the fight. But also, communication is probably the most important thing, because you can be in a relationship and be unhappy, and just because you're married for 20, 30 years, are you happy?
Right.
You know, I could say for half of my marriage, I probably wasn't, because I was so stubborn. I was trying to change him. And after probably 10 to 12 years, I realized I am never going to change him.
Yeah.
Like, I spent so long arguing and trying to prove a point, and realizing I have to learn to love him.
Right.
Just like he's learned to love me. And,
So
you know, allow God to be the one to make that change. Like you said, praying for your husband, because ultimately God is the only one who can truly transform.
Yes, 100% transform somebody's life. And, you know, I want to wrap this up. The last thing I thought just to mention as we close is a thought on emotional capacity. We give a lot of emotional capacity to a lot of different places. I say this because this is something that I struggle with, and have struggled with, is getting home and my family gets the very last of what I have to give. They get the exhausted Jolea. They get the I want to sit and veg Jolea. They get the burned out Jolea. And I realize that is not fair to them. And I think that we have to look at our emotional capacity, our physical capacity, and make sure that we're not every single day getting to the end of our day drained and not trying to give our spouses what they need. And so it's showing up when you don't feel like it, you know, you're drinking a little bit of coffee to end the night so that you're just awake with your kids and with your spouse, and just doing what you can to be present, and not just physically present, but emotionally present, mentally present, to really value the few hours that you have together in a day. If you guys are both working outside of the home, or, you know, even one is working outside of the home, I think that is really important, and something that I am learning to prioritize is bringing my best to my home each day. Well, great conversation. And again, like we said at the top of this episode, we're not marriage experts. Really, we hope we just emulated and gave you a place to hear that you're not alone, and emulated what community can look like, that what you're experiencing is probably not, you're not the only person that's experienced it, and that there's hope, that there are options, and that there's community, and that God has blessed and ordained your marriage for this season. And so marriage is going to require work. It's going to require that you fight, but we hope that you feel encouraged after listening to this episode. So we hope it bless you. If you know somebody that needs to hear this episode, be sure to share it. You can click the share button at the top of the podcast page. We would love to see you on the next episode, Your Best Self. Until then, we'll see you later.